I've never ever viewed my deafness as being a superpower in any way. Ableism, and including our own internalized ableism, is already rampant as it is. Taking away and plunging us further down into the red is really quite dangerous and really quite toxic and harmful.
So Warren, welcome to Disabled and Proud. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, Brooke. It's a pleasure to be here as well. Thank you.
Oh, no, thank you so much for agreeing to come on the podcast. I am genuinely so excited about this conversation because you have a depth and breadth of knowledge surrounding so many different areas that I cannot wait to pick your brain, particularly around disability, particularly around LGBTQ plus like information. I think it's going to be one of those episodes where I take everything in and I won't be able to stop thinking about it for days.
Really looking forward to it. So thank you for the invite. Certainly a lot to discuss. I mean, I've been a big fan actually of the Disabled and Proud podcast. So to receive an invite actually to take part, it's a real honor. So thank you again.
Oh, we love hearing things like this. Good way to boost my ego before we start. I love it. So the first question that I ask absolutely every single guest who comes on this podcast is, how do you refer to your disability?
An interesting one, isn't it? I mean, it's right up there in terms of diving straight in with the controversial subjects. I do like that. I will say straight off the bat, actually, that I've no problems with this particular D word. I've always considered myself to be disabled. It would be a struggle, especially given the severity of my hearing impairment. It would be a struggle to convince anybody, in fact, that I wasn't disabled relative to how dependent I am on these hearing aids. I know I do a very good impression of, and I do hate this phrase, but sort of normal, which I get told quite a lot. And, and it's quite the backhanded compliment, but I'm not a fan of this sort of narrative around differently abled, and I'm not a fan of calling my disability a superpower. And one thing that I'll say at the outset is that if you are part of the disabled community and you do identify using those terms, power to you. That's absolutely fine. But I just can't have that imposed upon me. I think that's something that for me, I've never ever viewed my deafness as being a superpower in any way. The fact of the matter is that to me, it's a weakness, it's a deficit. It has certain advantages. It has certain positive traits that come out of that as a result. And indeed, sort of like one could even say, I'm proud of the person who I am as a result of what the disability has in a sense. But no, I do want the tag, the label, the wording itself of disabled normalized throughout society. And I don't feel that people should be forced into accepting the notion that we're either not disabled or we're just differently abled or it's a superpower. I mean, I could go on. There's a few other labels, but I think those three that I tend to see as most prevalent in society and tend to have the most debates around them.
I'm so with you on differently abled and superpower because I actually, and this is very personal, this is nobody else's opinions, it's very much my own opinion, but I actually find it quite cringe because I don't think disability is a superpower. And I think the reason that we have that kind of narrative around it is because it's different. And for a very long time, a lot of people have been very scared of what is different. So the way that we make something different not so scary is to call it, superpower. And you become, like elevated, but actually that elevation can be quite dangerous and quite damning. And I think you're right. We've kind of come to a place in society, or at least I like to think that we are, that we can have these open and honest conversations about as to why we don't necessarily like these terms. But I'm with you as well. If you use differently abled, or if you use it, you say that your disability is a superpower, then like, peace to you. Like, that works for you, enjoy it. Like, you got to do whatever you got to do to sleep well at night. But I am with you on that. I do find it quite cringe.
There's one actually that comes up across the airwaves now and then, and you'll see a sign, and Boots were in trouble for it recently, and I think where I'm going with this. And of course, it's the infamous less abled. which I think that we, as with our, we know disability is not a monolith, but one thing that we can all agree on, whether we consider ourselves superheroes or merely disabled, is that less abled absolutely will not do. So that, for starters, I just want to put out there actually sort of that I condemn in the strongest possible terms, whether I see it in a car park, whether I see it on a restaurant, restroom door, when I see it on all of these different places in public, the message that is being sent out to members of the disabled community. And in fact, anybody who might just simply need to use that accessible space for what it is, accessible space, is actually having an even worse message put to them, which is that you're not disabled, you're simply less than. And that's quite the Pandora's box there, actually, that you have to wonder quite often sort of where the quality control is, where the marketing teams are. And as I say, nothing about us without us. And where are the disabled consultants? Where are the people who do have disabilities sort of being able to actually veto this stuff? And I suspect nowhere to be seen.
It's actually so interesting that you bring that up, because I said something quite similar recently at the BBC. I was having a conversation about a certain documentary that got made, and I was just saying that at what point did someone consult on this who wasn't necessarily involved in it? Because I think if someone outside of who was involved in it had consulted, you might have got a different answer and a different response to the response that you got. And it is that, isn't it? It's how do we let something like the less abled parking space or the documentary that I won't name be put out there in the public space without any thought of asking for anybody who is disabled to consult on it, and whether or not actually it benefits the community or not? Because there are a lot of things that do get put out there with the greatest intentions that fall so flat on their face because nobody has bothered to ask the disabled community whether or not it's actually helpful.
It is fascinating, isn't it? Because on the one hand, I have some sympathy for the differently abled and superpower brigade. I've got some sympathy in the sense that what they're trying to do is they're trying to take, as I perceive it, my weakness, my disability, my deficit, and they're trying to add to it. And you use the word elevate. Elevate is the best word, I think, for it. Trying to elevate what is. But what's actually happening, of course, with less able is that unquestionably you are taking away. And
yeah,
if you are taking away from an already marginalized community who does not, despite whatever the law may say, does not experience equality throughout society, where ableism, and including our own internalized ableism, is already rampant as it is, taking away and plunging us further down into the red is really quite dangerous and really quite toxic and harmful.
Yeah, it's so true. It is so true. And also interesting that you touched on our own internalized ableism there, because I think we never really sit back and think about how prevalent internalized ableism is until you really maybe even go on a deep dive of your own journey to figure out what ableism is. And then you realize how internalized ableism is for every single disabled person, but then how prevalent it is in society. And it's almost like a really big slap in the face that you didn't ask for.
Yeah, it is. And I must admit, actually, like so many things, internalized ableism, it traces back into childhood for the most part. Well, I mean, that's a generalization. In my case, of course, because I didn't acquire my disability, I don't know what normal hearing is. You know, I was born this way. I was born with, I suppose, to estimate it probably would have been moderate severe, and it's now severe. So, of course, it's essentially sort of degraded. So we've got sort of a bilateral sensorineural neural hearing loss in my case, which essentially means it's severe on both sides. So very heavily dependent on these hearing aids. And I've grown up with the benefit actually of lip reading, tuition and speech therapy as well, in the sense that that's actually been invaluable really for me to try. And I'm so conscious all the time, actually, funnily enough, of when I speak. Even speech is extremely deliberate. And I'm very aware. And I think I touched on childhood just a second ago, actually, sort of in terms of what that was like. And I think for me, now I'm just about to turn 40 years old, and my earliest memory of being consciously aware of being different or less than, you might say, was the fact that actually when it was pointed out to me when I was 5, nearly 6, that my hearing was poor. And it was finally tested, and I was suspected of being autistic, actually, growing up, because I was just quite a disruptive child in classroom settings. I didn't seem to want to concentrate on what the teachers wanted me to concentrate on. And that was something that was very frustrating for sort of, I suppose, institutions in the 80s. And you don't know what you don't know. So again, I have some sympathy for them looking back, but there was certainly a real problem in that I had this pointed out to me, and immediately it was assessed to be of a sort of severity that I had to leave mainstream education. And there was a real battle, actually, especially on my mother's part, to keep me in mainstream education. And I think what followed was a few years of real difficulty, having to kind of come to grips with that. And I think my first pair of hearing aids that I acquired, sort of, they were the size of a fist at the time, sort of like those awful NHS beige things that I was no fan of. I know they improve matters somewhat, but the old analog technology that we're using at the time didn't really attenuate the hearing loss correctly. So it's not just a matter of, as some people think, that the world just needs to be louder. It's actually about particular losses frequencies. So two people can both be classed as severely hearing impaired, as in my case, but we could have a complete flip side of each other's audiogram. And therefore we'd need completely different manufacturers of hearing aids. We'd need completely different programming and completely different audiological care. And as a result, of course, all of these subtleties were lost. So you simply just had hearing aids that magnified everything. So they were constantly in, constantly out. It drew the attention of a lot of children around me, and all of a sudden, get that real sort of experience for the first time of othering, and it's a tough thing, actually, sort of, age 6 or 7, some of the kids that you used to be quite at least sort of positive neutral with, for them to kind of treat it as a bit of a game, for you to be minding your own business in a classroom, and then to quick the hearing aids out of your ears and then sort of throw them to each other in a kind of game of piggy in the middle, I think it was called. But just generally, it's amazing sort of like how the morbid fascination of kids around difference, and however that manifests, as soon as it became apparent to people that the problem was that I couldn't hear, I would have, errant children. I'd just be, again, minding my own business, and they'd come and scream in my ear, for example, to see if I could hear it, and little things like that.
Oh my gosh.
And it's amazing, actually, how the teachers at the time didn't really have much control of the situation, sort of like, some altercation would ensue, I'd get upset, they'd, sort of like be encouraged as a result, but they were always, at least in those spaces, the teachers didn't really sort of clamp down on it. There was no real disability inclusion. There was no disability awareness. It was always just a case of settle down, go back to your seats, and, stop being disruptive. Disruption was all sort of treated exactly the same, to be honest. It was the same disruption as if you got up and stabbed someone with a compass, or you'd thrown something, across the room, and it wasn't sort of really looked at as being sort of individually to me or related to the disability. It was just sit down and be quiet. So anyway, sort of quite a tangent there, but sort of that went on certainly throughout school. And then going into secondary school, it sort of calmed down a little bit, and I think people get better. My speech was getting better, and sort of growing confidence. But it's disability itself, especially when born with it, is that it frames the narrative for so many of your situations from childhood onwards.
I love what you said there about school, because I think for a lot of disabled children, schools don't actually know how to handle disability at all. And it doesn't matter what the disability is, it is just a really big unknown. And quite often you're seen as a health and safety hazard. So it's very much be quiet, sit in the corner, and don't do anything, because if you break something, or heaven forbid you break yourself, I'm in even more trouble than I would be if it was a quote unquote normal child. And as we all know, normality, like, what is that? It doesn't exist. But it's very, very true what you say about schools not really knowing how to handle that type of situation, because it's a fear. They don't know how to handle it because there's a fear of, what if I get it wrong? So if I don't handle it, then I don't have to get it wrong. And I've not intervened, but I've also not made the situation worse, which again is incredibly problematic. But But I think it's so interesting how we don't have these conversations surrounding difference and disability as really young people. Because I think if we did, the world would be a better place, full stop. We would accept difference from a much earlier age, right? That there's no argument to be made that that wouldn't make it better.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But equally, if we did have these conversations, we'd maybe understand that humanity is not all one thing. And as we say so often, disability is not a monolith, and humanity also isn't a monolith either. So actually, there's nothing lost in having these conversations around diversity and disability at such a super young age. And I'm sometimes very jealous of the younger generation because I think they're so welcoming of diversity and difference way earlier on than we are. And they get it so much younger than we do. But I'm glad that there's a generation of people who are able to have these conversations at a much younger age and are actually much more accepting than maybe where you and I grew up, because I think it's needed. And that goes back to that internalized ableism, that hopefully younger generations won't have such ingrained internalized ableism from such a young age. And actually what you said about how being disabled children, it frames a lot of your like interactions with people, like some of your first interactions around, like particularly around school, particularly around like school clubs, all of that type of thing where you learn to socialize. It really does completely frame your childhood existence, because that's your first interactions with people who aren't your family. And as we all know, like if you're a disabled child or you acquired your disability incredibly young, your family are your biggest supporters. They will move hell and earth for you. That is life, and they're so great, and it's such a comfortable space. But actually when you go outside of that space and you're in, you know, society for young children, I'm not talking about like you're 18, you're going to uni, I'm talking about when you're maybe 8 and you're having like your first after school clubs. They do inform your experiences of different people who aren't your family, and then again that goes to that internalized ableism as well, because everybody's going to treat you differently if you present as completely different.
Mm-hmm. It's true, because unfortunately we're still, I mean, obviously sort of I work in DEI now, so therefore of course sort of, you know, handling diversity, equity, inclusion is very much part of my day job. And indeed, in fact, actually so much of my early experience thinking about it feeds into the work that I do now. So
Yeah.
there's that, of course, somewhat the subject of another conversation. But one thing I do notice actually is that sort of earlier on, if we're training institutions and we're training children not to have those conversations, and like what I was saying before and what we were talking about just now in relation to, if you don't call something what it is, if you're simply just treating an incident that is disability related, if you know a child has a hearing aid pulled out of their ear, and the whole interaction is based entirely effectively on what they can't do, the disability. In your case, if a group of young children, you know, children, and you're a young child, sort of literally gather around you to tease you about a limb difference, that cannot be labeled in my mind as merely sort of playing in class disruption. You're talking about something that you're talking about exclusion based solely on a person's difference and their disability. But what's happening, of course, is that to avoid having these difficult conversations, whether it's paperwork related or whether it's fear of the Equality Act or whether it's, as it then was, of course, but or whether it's fear of just saying the wrong thing, getting into trouble with whomever, frankly, is that the discussions are not being had, it's not being called what it is. And you do hear sort of like some heartening counter narratives to that. For example, when a few years back I was doing some work with the National Deaf Children's Society, where hearing aids themselves, I mean, I've been trying for decades to make hearing aids sexy. I haven't I haven't quite succeeded, but some of the kids actually these days are at least making hearing aids cool. And they you know, designs these days actually sort of, you know, bright green, bright pink, you know, sort of like they're actually designed to stand out, which was the opposite of what I was trying to do growing up, because I'd never wanted to stand out, because schools and growing up, you're not rewarded in any way, shape or form for difference, you're rewarded for conformity. And there's something very powerful that as you grow older, and I mean, especially at the age I am now, is that conformity is the last thing on my mind. But it was the first thing on my mind in school, of wanting to just simply blend in and sort of wallflower my way through these institutions, because it was very difficult. And yeah, it does. It frames the it frames the anything that's happening to you through childhood, good or bad, frames a lot of how you see of how you deal with sort of, you know, certain situations and coping skills and those mechanisms that come later. I think certainly, of course, a lot of it did feed into sort of my choice of career and what happened afterwards.
Yeah, well, this is such a seamless transition. Honestly, I'm proud of this transition because I like to talk about how, if in any way, your disabilities impacted your career choice. I think actually something you said before we talk about that that I think I've really picked up on is the idea that conformity helps you when you're in school. And actually, I had a light bulb moment in my head, and I was like, that's why I wasn't good at school because I never conformed. That was why I wasn't good. That's why all the teachers were not my friends because I argued with them. That's why. I was that person that consistently asked why, and I never really understood as to why a teacher had more power over a group of children than the children, like not being able to express the conversation that they wanted to. I never really understood why one adult could shut down a conversation if they deemed it to be inappropriate or not going the right way, or it wasn't educational enough, when actually, you know, it was still on topic. It just wasn't necessarily the way that they wanted it to go. And that now makes so much sense. It's because I don't like to conform, and here we are.
It's a good thing these days you get to set your own agenda, isn't it? I think it suits you.
Do you know what I think it does as well? I think I needed that freedom. I was never meant to be boxed in.
I love it. Well, I think to the question about, I mean, it's many and varied ways, multifaceted answer, but certainly in terms of the career itself, I mean, the part of this, I suppose what you'd say, this sort of the real job, the real career over the last 15 years was corporate finance. So I still am a qualified solicitor. I qualified just over a decade ago. And I think the sort of the lead up to that. So I did a law degree way back when, Oxford University, unimaginatively then became a lawyer. That was fine and good actually, but at the same time, the gateway certainly to that profession, it's very, in my case, you know, the high end sort of the sharp end, as it were, of practicing law in the city, the big bad corporate firms, is that disclosure around disability is a real issue. Again, conformity, being a cookie cutter trainee lawyer, being a cookie cutter junior lawyer, mid-level associate, one sense of individuality doesn't really get to come out really until I would say you become a senior associate. It's not the case for all lawyers going through, and in fact, I'm heartened to see that there's quite a few sort of people breaking the mold now, sort of like whether they're neurodivergent or whether they're LGBTQ plus, you know, disabled, you name it, sort of the various intersections of their identity. People are sort of grasping, you know, taking control of, I think, their own careers and that aspect of their identity a lot sooner than I did, because I was extremely passive. And again, it was a story of trying to conform. It was a story of trying to fit in, which in my case, there were two big ones, you know, sort of obviously hiding my my sexuality. It was easier to simply pass as heterosexual, the default, if you will. I'm actually bisexual, but it was one of those things that I simply didn't talk about because what homophobic, transphobic, and indeed biphobic environments, as best I could tell, that sort of corporate hostility to those aspects of identity was certainly prevalent when I was joining. The disability, however, itself and how that really impacted was that I had to reckon very, very early on with the fact that this was going to have to be my big difference. I didn't want to talk about sexuality because I had the disability that I couldn't hide. I could hide the sexuality, so I didn't want to stack that on top because I was worried what would happen if I was different and different again. But if I could just work with the disability and be, as I suppose, conventional and conformist in all other respects, that was an acceptable margin of risk for me. But again, the disability came up over and over and over. And it is tricky, certainly, because people don't necessarily, because of how I present, they don't necessarily realize that it's there a lot of the time. And I could not be doing this podcast if I was not looking at, whenever you speak, I would have to look at those captions. I'm unable to follow a television program without captions. A radio is useless to me. I can't use a telephone in the normal way. I can't just casually pick up the phone and do a call if I can't see a speaker. There's a bunch of stuff that I struggle with. So conference calls with clients and that sort of thing were very, very, very challenging. And I think when frustrations bubbled over and when things were not done as quickly as possible, and when I was not able to effectively do it over email, but was trapped onto doing detail-orientated work over calls, the frustrations of sort of more senior lawyers would bubble over, where they'd say things like, you just need to listen harder. And when stuff like that happens, you're kind of like, it doesn't matter really sort of like what other achievements you've got to your name or how good you might have been feeling about yourself. Like a moment like that will just bring all of it tumbling down. So there was a lot of that going on in my career, sort of, peaks and troughs. So it was not a linear progression. I was doing well, and I was able to sort of, become a senior associate over time before I left law and went into DEI. But again, once again, the disability was a constant framing of a narrative.
It's so interesting that you say, and I'm picking up on what you said about disability and sexuality, was that you couldn't hide the disability, so you just stuck with that rather than disclosing your sexuality, because actually to stack that on top of your disability, like you said, was different. And then it's another difference added on top of that. And actually at that point in time in your life, conformity was what you wanted to do. And that is absolutely fine. We all go through moments where we want to do what's best for us. And then particularly when it comes to career, you're right, sometimes it's right if you want to progress in your career just to conform, particularly if we're talking about corporate world, right? Because corporate's very, very different to the world of freelance, the world of, talking about DEI, all of these types of things. But it's so interesting, isn't it, what you said, that you couldn't hide your disability. So that was like the thing that people knew you for. Whereas, it was easy for you to hide your sexuality, so you didn't talk about it. And I think that that's such an interesting conversation to have, because it all goes to that whole idea of passing as normal, doesn't it? Like what what is normal, and if we don't look different or we don't act different, then we pass as normal and we can progress further, and that's the whole issue with society, right? That's why we're having these conversations, because we can be disabled and proud, and who knew? But actually there's a lot to be said for it, because what would have happened if, during that time where you weren't talking about your sexuality, if someone had said to you something that really, may have knocked your confidence about your disability, but then also knocked your confidence about your sexuality, and where do you go and where do you have these conversations that make you feel empowered enough in who you are? Did they exist? Maybe not, I don't know. But I just think it's so prevalent to have these conversations, because there could be a younger version of you out there who needs to know that they can be who they are, even if it feels a bit icky right now.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's something actually that it's always present actually sort of in my mind in relation to the fact that would I have done things differently? What advice would I give a younger version of me? What advice would I give someone with a disability like mine coming up through the, doing what I did? And I must admit, actually, is that I hesitate to think that I would have done anything differently. Because at the time, it always truly felt like it was plotting the safest course of action. I was in a genuinely homophobic environment. I was in a genuinely, every sort of, phobia and ism going, to be honest, because places like, law and banking, they're sort of very, they're sort of casually racist, casually.
It's a boys' club. It's very much like an undercover boys' club.
Sort of that boys' club and all the rest of it like that. So it certainly, the way that I presented outside in relation to sort of my look and how I sounded, I was otherwise a prototype of what, white male, Oxbridge and so on, assuming heterosexual and all the rest of it, good old boy from the Shires. I looked and sounded the part of the kind of person who tends to succeed and do well in those settings. So I'm always hesitant in terms of, would I sort of find myself an activist or at the barricades if I were to do it again? Chances are I wouldn't, because in all honesty, I was able to leverage certain privileges that I had, chiefly my whiteness and my maleness. That I talk a lot actually about sort of privilege within the margins. And yes, I've got a marginalized identity and a severe disability in play, but I'm not a woman, I'm not black. For example, just to take sort of like to completely flip it, white man to black woman, how would a black woman navigate my disability in the same environment? If you take an intersectional lens, the advice that you can give someone who looks like me is that if you can just about conform, you'll probably be all right. Whereas could I give the same advice to someone who has the same disability as me but doesn't look anything like me? No, I couldn't. So even advice itself cannot be a one size fits all. One thing I would say, though, as a slight regret, is that I do wish I'd been a little bit bolder in terms of just owning the disability a little bit sooner, because too often I let other people, especially as a very junior lawyer and just qualified, too often I let other people put ideas into my head. So, for example, when partners would put ideas in my head, such as you can't tell clients about your disability because if they find out, they won't want to pay for your services because they'll think that you've got a substandard associate in there. That we, because we charge premium rates, that you'll be less capable. And I was told that sort of thing to my face. And therefore, there was a constant knocking of that confidence and almost a sense of, you should be grateful even to be here. You should be grateful even to do this job, be quiet and carry on. So I would have liked to have been bolder or feel emboldened a little bit sooner. But again, internalized ableism, it's a powerful thing. It's something that as a society, we and as parents, as throughout anybody who's mentoring younger people, the sooner you can unpack that internalized ableism, the sooner you can chop that tree down at root, the better it's going to be when they do eventually go to the workplace, and they don't have to wait to a certain level of seniority that I effectively became before I started really seizing my own narrative and turning that a little bit.
I don't have the words to express how upset I am that someone said to you, don't disclose your disability to a client. I don't have those words, because I just think, I would never say that to anyone in a million years. I'd be like, no, tell people who you are, because that's the kind of person I am. But equally, how dare someone make you feel less than for doing the exact same job that they're doing? How dare someone do that? Because actually, what a load of rubbish. Like, what a load of absolute rubbish. And I just think it's from that place of almost fear again, isn't it? That, you're disabled, therefore you must be infectious. Don't pass the disability on. Don't do this. And it's very much that narrative of keep the disability hidden, keep it quiet, don't let anybody know, because if they do, all hell will break loose. The demons will come up from the underworld and they'll take over. It's very much that narrative, and it makes me so mad, but also really happy, because then I get to talk to you about what was it like transitioning from corporate spaces and then deciding to maybe leave that and go into DEI, because I think they're very different, but they might not be. So please enlighten me.
Well, I mean, chiefly amongst them, and in fact, just before I get onto that, actually, sort of, another side of that narrative around disability and how it was spoken to me and how it was talked about was that a partner, again, going back many, many years now, actually did take me aside, and we were at drinks. It was a social setting away from sort of these horrors of work. And he disclosed, and again, sort of probably thought it was a sort of bit of a compliment, actually, but he said, you know what, if other people were, sorry, how to say, what did he say? He said, yes, I'm going to try and go with the exact words. He said, if other people were disabled the way you're disabled, we'd hire a lot more of them. Because you're really high functioning, you're basically normal. That's verbatim.
You're basically normal.
You're really high functioning, you're basically normal. And I remember, because of sort of when that kind of thing comes from a high-ranking equity partner, and you're a couple of years qualified, and you're a social and all the rest of it, and you're sort of surrounded by clients, and the spoils of a job well done. Again, you internalize it differently to how I would internalize something like that now, which would be like, you what? I would have sort of bucked against that sort of thing, but again, I just absorbed it into myself and thought, yes, I'm going to be okay. It's going to be all right. And I must admit, it's the toxicity of that water that people are swimming in, the acidity of that water, and how tough it really is for people trying to navigate disability in hard-edged corporate environments, especially when you start adding intersections into their identity around race, gender, neurodivergence, and indeed anything else. socioeconomic status. Now, moving from corporate, hard-edged corporate, and having that fee earner background and having sort of worked for a long time in those satanic mills and survived them, certainly informs a lot of the work that I do now. Because one thing that was quite interesting is that going into DEI, and I suppose COVID was a little bit of a catalyst actually, because you'd have to be very willfully ignorant to ignore the blatant disparities, whether it's of wealth and opportunity and everything else that exists in our so-called equal and free society. So taking that into account, COVID actually did really set aside the haves and the have-nots and all the rest of it like that. And one thing that for me, I was already as a senior associate by that point mentally on the way out. I've been fortunate enough through corporate finance that I no longer had a mortgage that had been taken care of. So I suppose the sort of the chief financial burden that means that people have to get up and perform and, you know, in these horrible money traps was no longer over me. I don't have children, so I didn't have school fees, I didn't have childcare fees, I didn't have nursery fees, I didn't have all that hanging over me either. So there was a sense of freedom actually as lockdown went onwards, that I don't have to keep tolerating this industry. I don't have to keep tolerating the way this makes me feel. And in fact, towards the back end of COVID and as 2021 came in, I took my last bonus check and that was it. I left the profession and that was that, left it behind. Took a few months off, decided definitively that I wanted to turn my volunteering in DEI into my full-time job, because it was something that I'd always enjoyed. And the key difference, funnily enough, is being able to finally harness the power of those differences, the very things that I was constantly having to suppress when it was like you couldn't talk about your disability, and you certainly, in my case, couldn't talk about one's sexuality. Ironically, those are the very things that they've actually, those flaws from my old life become my features for my DEI offering. And it doesn't mean, for example, that I understand racism. I'm white, I don't experience racism. I'm a man, I don't experience misogyny. It's not imbued me with lived experience that I didn't have, but it has enabled me to take the lived experience that I do have and experience and some semblance and some notion of what othering and marginalization feels like, actually apply it with an intersectional lens to the work that I do right now, and walk into the room and say, well, hey, I'm not a non-disabled, neurotypical, you know, cis man and all the rest of it like that. Don't shoot. So being able to actually lead with those attributes as opposed to constantly have to hide them. And that to me is priceless. It has been priceless for my well-being and sense of purpose in the world. Sorry, that was quite a speech, wasn't it? So
no, but these are things that we actually need to have these conversations, because as you said, what would have been deemed your weakness in a corporate job actually is completely now your strength in a DEI sense. And actually, I think we need to kind of take that a bit on board, is that actually sometimes you do have to be in a place that's uncomfortable, because I speak about this a lot and I say this an awful lot, but uncomfortability leads to growth. Whether that's good growth or bad growth, it does lead to growth. That's just the science of it, right? And actually you grew so much in your corporate job, it didn't fit you any longer. And you're right about COVID, and there's so much that I could go on to say about COVID and disability, because you must live under a rock if you don't understand how disproportionately affected disabled people were through COVID than those who were non-disabled. I think it's 6 out of every 10 deaths were disabled people. If you were learning disabled, you had it and you went into hospital, you got an involuntary DNR on your chart. It was involuntary, and that's a legal piece of paper. As you know, you were in law. You can't remove them from your medical file. So there's so many different things that come up through that, right? And actually, now that you work in DEI and you're able to talk about your differences and is it intersectionalities? That word? It is a word. Is amazing, because I think everybody should be able to talk about who they are and what they are without fear of repercussion. And that's what it all comes down to, is being able to talk about who you are and what you do and what you like and what you don't like and what you think is right and wrong, but actually without fear of being judged and without these big repercussions. But the way that you talk about intersectionality, I think, is so eloquent. because there's not a lot of people who have the ability to talk about really difficult things like intersectionality in a way that makes it accessible for everyone. Because I think a lot of people get very, very nervous surrounding intersectionality because we don't necessarily know how to have these conversations. And the fact that you're able to then go into places and facilitate these conversations that are inherently uncomfortable, because as you said, you're a white cis male presenting, and actually that's not necessarily your reality. But being able to facilitate that conversation to make someone feel comfortable, even the uncomfortability, is amazing.
I think for me, I mean, intersectionality, just absorbing that statement really, because intersectionality is one of the most misused and widely abused concepts in all of DEI work. It's often co-opted these days to effectively just be synonymous with difference.
Yeah.
You talk about the oppressions of race and gender and how that actually affects a person's lived experience, how that affects how they experience our workplaces, how they experience society, what they might be subject to. As I said before, a Black woman, the things that she would be subject to that I would never be subject to. And therefore, that also, for me, comes across when it comes to disability. I talk a lot about how I experience my disability, however severe, in a rather privileged way because of my privileged attributes, my whiteness, the certain way you're presenting, even the, I'll air quote it, but straight passing, that straight passing privilege that I have, I'm well aware of it. And that is something that I can't really co-opt, I can't opt out of, rather. I have that privilege regardless. It follows me everywhere that I go. I'm even conscious of the way that I look and sound, my physical presentation, this how I articulate myself. All of these things essentially sort of add up to a very privileged picture. So that disability is not the same impediment that it was to me as when I was a 6-year-old and relatively defenseless, without all of those power, without all of those attributes that have made me relatively powerful and safe in society. And it's not being talked about enough how a Black person or a member of the global majority, someone who is not white, experiences their neurodivergence and their disability perhaps in a completely different way, even if we're talking about exactly the same condition on paper. So I like to talk about that a lot. I recognize that anti-racism, combating anti-Blackness is, and in fact, decolonization is the underpinning of DEI work. It's the reason DEI exists in the first place, and on account actually of the civil rights movement. It's not just difference for difference's own sake. There are actually layers to oppression. And if a person like me is in DEI, especially if I have a leading role in DEI, the first thing that I always want to ask someone who looks and sounds like me is, what's your take on anti-racism? And what are you doing around that? What do you understand around that? Are you deconstructing that racism in yourself? Are you really looking critically at yourself and your practice? Or are you simply just saying, well, I've got my, single issue diversity? Are you simply just getting into the work to, for your own self-serving reasons? So there's a lot to unpack that. And I sort of have a certain mistrust of, I will go so far as to say white people in leading roles of DEI, actually, if they're not very openly combating that anti-Blackness and dealing with anti-racism. I don't like that very much at all, seeing it when it's just DEI for the sake of, it's just LGBTQ plus, or it's just disability, or it's just this, it's just that. It's all of those things, but it is absolutely underpinned by race and gender.
Yeah. These conversations are not had enough, particularly surrounding DEI. And I say this as someone who knows an awful lot of people in DEI, and it is incredibly whitewashed. And how are we meant to have conversations that combat all forms of difference, disability, race, gender, sexuality? You're right, if we're not actively dismantling racism, because actually you're right, at the underpin of all of DEI, it's all about dismantling the belief systems that we have, and particularly around decolonization, because I think that's a fascinating topic to talk about, particularly decolonization and disability. Like, again, people don't like to have that conversation because it's uncomfortable. You know, we're having this conversation, and I'm very aware that I am a cisgender white woman with blonde hair. I'm 5'3". I'm a size 8. In terms of the world, I have an awful lot of privilege. I have a lot of privilege, right? And particularly surrounding my disability, it's very, very obvious. But if I wear a jacket, you probably wouldn't know. So therefore, I go on as passing as someone who is non-disabled until I take my jacket off. But people don't like to admit that, because as soon as you admit that you have some form of privilege, you are seen as part of the problem. And if you're not actively trying to deconstruct or kind of pick apart your own part in the problem, then you're not really doing your job. And a lot of people don't like that conversation around DEI, because you're right, a lot of people just like to say, I'm a DEI person because I talk about disability.
Well, it's fundamentally unregulated. Anybody, and LinkedIn shows us this, anybody can rock up and self-certify as a DEI advocate or a DEI expert, God forbid. And actually, there's a lot of harm being done by people, especially if they're white women going from HR roles and then simply parachuting into a DEI role. And you have that sort of absurd situation that I often talk about, where if you've got a black woman who's coming to them and saying, I've experienced racism at work, and you've got the 2 white women from HR sitting there saying, are you sure? No, you haven't. You get very quickly into a very problematic system where that is actually functioning exactly as designed, but it's continually producing inequitable outcomes, because you've got people adjudicating over these questions who don't have the lived experience and will never have the lived experience because they're white. They don't experience racism. And I will say until my dying day that reverse racism is utter BS. That just is. And so we end up with these we do have a lot of problems in DEI itself. There's a lot of, I mean, it's a subject of a whole other podcast, to be honest, but I do believe that white people have the most work to do in relation to that, especially when it comes to unpacking their own racism, unpacking that anti-blackness, unpacking actually that I, for example, for many years, I've always been disabled, but I've also been able to profit, as it were, at a high level, working in corporate finance as often as I did, from working in an environment that prioritized people who look like me, that always made it easy for people like me if I conformed to succeed and continue to walk through open doors. And the further away in terms of identity that you get from that sort of straight presenting cis white male, the harder it becomes for people as a general rule. And yes, you will find, of course, notable exceptions, but those notable exceptions do not disprove the rule, unfortunately. That is the experience for many.
Yeah. It's just so much to unpack. And it's not, I don't say that as being like it's too much, but it's very, very deep. And it's quite often deconstructing and dismantling the way that you view the world is not how it actually is. And for some people, that's like, again, going back to being uncomfortable, it's inherently uncomfortable to be told that you are part of the problem. And sometimes I was having this conversation actually surrounding disability, and I was saying, you know, sometimes you just have to be uncomfortable. There sometimes is no solution to being uncomfortable. You just have to sit through it and understand that actually maybe you are part of the problem, and that being uncomfortable is good because you're realizing that there is a problem and you're part of it and you can learn from that experience. But you don't always need to make a comment. You just need to know that it's uncomfortable and it's not right.
I want to remain at the front line of the work that I'm doing, because this is real identity-centric purpose work. And I do believe it's been my destiny all along. You know, I'm not sort of a person who's superstitious in any way, but the long arc of time, actually, of being kind of going through that corporate side, a few pit stops along the way, to now do the purpose work that I do now, it's such a blessing. And being able to find my people, being able to be more freely and openly myself, being able to hear the stories of others, being able to actually have the time and the headspace to be able to have activities like this, to be having this conversation with you, a peer and a colleague in this work. All of that is a real honor. All of that is a different type of privilege, and one that I'm happy to embrace. And so I'm proud of that, actually, because of course it's not lost on me that this is a disabled and proud podcast. So I can't not talk about pride at some point, and it's a different type of pride. We touched on before about how the intersections of identity, how LGBTQ plus and openly so these days, that's a very different sort of open form of pride in a way. And disabled pride is much more complex and much more nuanced to me, because I was not always proud of the disabled aspect of my identity. I'm still not, if I'm honest. I'm not proud of being disabled. I'm not proud of the fact that my ears don't work as nature intends. I am proud of the person I am as a result of that marginalization. I'm proud of what I've gone through, prevailed over, and what I'm here to do now in a better late than never sense. So there's a lot of nuances around those, how those particular prides sort of fit together and how different they are, and how I conceive of them completely differently in my mind. And other people might have a very different take. After all, if you consider yourself to have a superpower, perhaps that you shout from the rooftops about how proud you are about being disabled. But too often for me, when you go down that sort of toxic positivity, you are the kind of person who sits out on the sidelines and expects every person with a limb difference, or if they're a little person, to become a Paralympian, for example. Or you...
This point exactly. This point exactly.
You know, you're a superhero. You should try out for the Olympics, or just, I mean, I'm being flippant, but it's that sort of mindset, that sort of nonsense. So what we don't necessarily do with disability is celebrate the everyday. We don't celebrate the right to be average, the right to be mediocre, the right simply to flop down on your bed at the end of the day, or sit down and watch Netflix, or however you spend your time doing. We don't necessarily celebrate the ordinary victories and the everyday magic and heroes that comes with disabled identity.
We never celebrate just being average and disabled, because we have this, I wouldn't say that, I mean, we as in like society, not as in we as in me and you having this conversation, but we have this idea that to be a good, quote unquote, good disabled person means that you are a Paralympian, or you've climbed Mount Everest and you have no hands and no feet, or you've done something that it's extraordinary, right? But what about all the people, heavy on the inspiration porn, but what about all of the people who are just living their lives? You can be bog standard and disabled, and you can still celebrate that. You do not have to be a Paralympian to be a good disabled person. You don't even have to be a good disabled person. You can have pride in your disability and still be a dick. You can be like, but as society, we don't like to say that, because at some point, you know, you've got to almost prove that you should be here if you're disabled, or you need to bring extra value. There should be something extra and added to you as a person. Like for you, for example, you know, saying that hearing is your superpower. I wouldn't be surprised if someone in your life had said to you, oh, I bet that you can feel the music through the floor. You know, that's your superpower. Like you can feel the beat, or something along those lines, because we never have it where it's actually, yeah, but I don't like music. You know, we don't celebrate that. Actually, like I'm a very, very bog standard normal person. I just also happen to be disabled, and I love that so much. But then touching on what you said about pride, because I think pride is a very, very strong word, and obviously, like, I'm full of pride to be disabled. I wouldn't have created a podcast if I wasn't, and I wouldn't be having these conversations surrounding this topic. But pride in the sense of disability pride, and pride in the sense of LGBTQ plus pride, they're two very different things that they quite often get, I want to say, conflated, and I'm not necessarily sure that's the right word, but I feel like it fits this purpose right now. And how do we have this conversation where actually disability pride and sexual pride, LGBTQ plus pride, how do we have this conversation where we say actually they're both equally very important, but they're actually very different?
Well, I think as with so many societal issues, awareness and understanding is key. So we
Mhm.
have the disability pride flag. We have the main pride flag, which of course has changed now to include intersex people, and of course, you know, the progress flag as its name. So you have Pride Month in June, immediately
Mhm.
followed, I know lots of people still don't know this, in July, by
Like
Disability Pride
disability
Month.
pride.
And all too often, where you have the pride seasons, and you'll have UK Black Pride, and you'll have Trans Pride, and you'll have Bi Pride, and I attended all of them, and I enjoyed them very much, and so on. It's part of that. But what's fascinating is that when you have, we talked about conflating, and when you have Disability Pride Month appearing in July, it appears to be one of the prides. And to the untrained eye,
Essentially.
because it's even got its own rainbow flag, if you will, you know, obviously got sort of, you know, the dark gray background and sort of like, you know, those muted colors and so on, sort of like several colors for signifying different types of disability. It's a type of rainbow flag, albeit much less colorful and much less eye-catching, but it's a type of rainbow flag. And therefore, as a result, lots of people in their minds still think of disability pride as being related to that mainstream pride. Now, the
Yeah.
mainstream pride, of course, belongs to LGBTQ plus and that community. But the beauty of it, of course, going back to intersectional perspectives, is the LGBTQ plus community already contains disabled people. We've got one. It anybody. I exist. It's like
Yeah.
it shouldn't surprise anybody to know that the LGBTQ plus community itself, the rainbow community, is no monolith. That you will have
Yeah.
Black people in there, brown people in there, white people in there, neurodivergent people, you know, tall people, short people, disabled people, and so on and so on. You know, the beauty of human diversity exists within that community, just like any other. So therefore, I would very much like us as a society and in our workplaces to truly carve out Disability Pride Month and recognize it and celebrate it for what it is, which is it's actually about disabled identity. It has
Yeah.
nothing to do inherently with LGBTQ+. It's about disabled identity. And however you identify, going right back to the start in terms of about labels and in terms of how we refer to ourselves, how we identify, if you're part of that community, how you identify and how you handle and relate to your disability and interface with the world is inherently valid. But equally, there's still not enough support and not enough equity out there in workplaces and societies, in schools, in all of these different places where you have to, you know, grow up and, you know, run those gauntlets. You know, there's not enough opportunities yet to be proud and disabled.
Yeah.
There's not the same opportunity to be out and proud that we have with mainstream pride. It's still a more muted celebration, and I'm not even sure it is necessarily a celebration. And there's a real counter narrative about the fact that I don't want to celebrate my disability. I don't feel proud about my disability. And those views are valid as well. But awareness and understanding about the fact that we are here, the disabled community has rights, and we have the rights not to just be superheroes or to be referred as such, but to just go about live our lives in peace, and for people to have more empathy and understanding for us. I would love to see that, and I would love to see corporations actually changing their logos to the Disability Pride flag, for example, and that to me will start to feel a little bit like progress, but equally that can't just be performative in nature. It has to truly go to the substance of how you're treating, how you're hiring and retaining and promoting your disabled staff. Again, another conversation for another day. The pride dynamic between the two, and especially because they're back to back in the calendar, it causes a bit of head scratching.
I honestly think we might have to do a part two because there's so much to dive into, and you're not, like, as I said at the beginning, your knowledge is so depth. It's got so much depth to it. And actually these are the type of conversations that we need to be having. But I'm gonna end with my traditional question, which you kind of answered, but I kind of want you to answer it again, just because I think it needs to be said. And that is, Warren, are you disabled and proud?
Today, yes. It wasn't always the way, but today, yes. For reasons that I hope have become clear through talking about my journey, my career, childhood, life, all of these different influences, and the person that I am now, and being able to leave behind those privileges and be able to learn more about myself, and indeed about others as well. And I would say yes, I am.
Thank you so much for being on the podcast today. I have loved this conversation. I think there's been so much covered. And actually, do you know what? It might be a really uncomfortable listen for people, but actually, as we've said many times throughout this conversation, sometimes you just have to be uncomfortable. So firstly, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge, and thank you so much for giving up a time of your day to come and speak to me, because I've loved it.
Likewise, that feeling is certainly mutual, Brooke. So if we ever need to do it again, absolutely.